Should the United States repeal the Second Amendment? A former Supreme Court justice says yes, adding it's time to get real and live in the 21st century, not in the 1700s. What do you think? The polls are open right now at WTSP.com/vote now. You already know the Second Amendment protects your right to keep guns, but it is worth reading exactly how this is all worded in the constitutional amendment itself. Take a look. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Let's talk more about the former justice who wants that amendment gone. John Paul Stevens wrote an opinion piece in response to the Parkland mass shooting. He retired from the court in 2010 after more than 35 years. He was on the losing end of a 2008 ruling in which the High Court held that the Second Amendment gives individuals a right to own a gun for self-defense. Stevens said the decision in the Heller case, quote, provided the NRA with a propaganda weapon of immense power. In this New York Times op-ed, the 97-year-old suggested that getting rid of the Second Amendment would do more to weaken the NRA's ability to, quote, block constructive gun control legislation and be a more effective and more lasting reform. He wrote, concerned that a national standing army might pose a threat to the security of the separate states led to the adoption of that amendment and that it is a relic of the 18th century. Stevens also embraced legislation that would ban semi-automatic weapons, increase minimum age for buying a gun from 18 to 21 years old, and establish a more comprehensive background check system on all firearm purchases. Former Justice Stevens thinks that students should be the ones going after that amendment. Nightside reporter Josh Shadorowitz spoke to some students who were a part of the March for Our Lives demonstrations over this past weekend. But if you think you know how they'd feel about a proposal to completely scrap the Second Amendment, you might be surprised.
I think it's an awful idea.
In today's climate, it's almost a little bit far-fetched.
Both Macy and Parisa argue their involvement in the March for Our Lives movement is not about totally disarming Americans.
As a collective movement with this March for Our Lives, we want just stricter regulation as to what people do have rights to have.
I'm going for compromise, and I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment right. I feel that some people do need it for protection.
We're protesting people being able to have military-grade weapons, and we're protesting forms of gun violence where the person who has the weapon should have never been able to commit that crime.
Mainly, they want a ban on AR-15 or other high-powered rifles. That said, they also represent a faction of people who do not believe the Second Amendment is something set in stone either.
People say, you know, our founding fathers would never take away our guns if they wrote it in the Constitution, but there's a literal quote by Thomas Jefferson on the Jefferson Memorial saying, you know, if the times call for it and change needs to happen, then change should happen.
She is referring to, by the way, this quote that is etched into the south portico at the Jefferson Memorial. With the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. I'm Josh Sidorowitz, 10 News.
Also impacted, of course, are gun owners. Nightside's Sarah Rosario spoke to some who say if any repeal actually happens, they will fight for their guns.
If guns are illegal, we're just going to have more Boston bombings. If guns are illegal, more people are going to get stabbed. Crazy people want to do crazy things, and they're going to figure out whatever weapon or device they can to make that happen.
Teaching people to legally carry guns and defend themselves is how Ryan Thomas makes his living.
What's a red flag to you that something's off?
He says a suggestion by former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens to get rid of the Second Amendment would never fly. People taking his class agree.
Well, that's just not going to happen. Sorry, there are too many people with guns that are going to fight that.
While the opinion addresses not enough being done after recent mass shootings, Thomas says in each case there seems to be more of an issue with ignored warning signs about the gunman instead of the gun.
So how can we blame the gun when we trusted the government, we told them that was happening multiple times, and they refused to do anything?
The opinion also makes no mention of how to handle things like hunting, target shooting, or gun collecting, only saying the amendment is ancient. Others say the Second Amendment is a necessity.
You know, we can't always trust the federal government. That they do wrong just like we do wrong, but, you know, it was given to us in case they ever want to stomp on us and try to completely control us.
And while there are always calls for gun control after mass shootings, Thomas says that's when he sees more people trying to protect themselves and says that likely won't change anytime soon. Sarah Rosario, 10 News.
So what would it take to actually make this happen? Brendan Barry is a constitutional law professor at Cooley Law School. Break it down for me. Is this even realistic?
I don't think so. I mean, I know that for gun control advocates and opponents of the NRA, this would probably be a dream come true. I have some bad news, though. I think it's more of a pipe dream at this point. What it would take to repeal a constitutional amendment, either 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, would have to propose the amendment, or 2/3 of the state legislatures around the United States would have to call for a constitutional convention. And that doesn't even get you there. If either of those two things happens, you still need 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify a constitutional amendment. And we got to keep in mind, Republicans control both houses of Congress. Right now, they control 32 state legislatures at last count. So in an age when we can barely get people to agree about anything, those kinds of supermajorities are probably impossible to reach.
All right, so pretty impossible, but work with me here. Let's say this did happen. What does it mean then at the state level?
That would mean that the federal government would be out of it. It's no longer a federal constitutional right. So that leaves states free to handle the firearms and guns issue however they want to. Each state could enact its own, kind of its own little mini version of the Second Amendment to protect guns, or they could leave things where they are. But certainly, if there's no Second Amendment, then states are free to do whatever they want in terms of gun control and firearms.
All right, thank you.